The last few days have produced many loud headlines. Ukraine supposedly gained the upper hand, the Russian offensive is supposedly choking, and drones have supposedly already changed the entire logic of war, according to Viktor Yagun, director of the Security Sector Reform Agency, Major General of the SBU Reserve. He says that some of these assessments are justified. But it is strategically important not to fall into either euphoria or complacency. The real picture is more complicated. Ukraine is indeed building up its technological initiative. In May, the Ministry of Defense put into service 175 new models of weapons and military equipment, almost 93% of which are Ukrainian developments. This means that the Ukrainian defense industrial complex is gradually moving from survival mode to scaling mode. The key direction is unmanned systems. It's not just about FPV on the front line anymore. Ukraine is actively developing a medium-range and long-range strike component that allows it to strike at logistics, warehouses, command posts, air defense systems, oil refineries, and the Russian military infrastructure in depth. This fundamentally changes the nature of war. Whereas previously Russia could relatively safely accumulate resources in the rear, pull up reserves, and supply the front via long logistical routes, now this depth is becoming increasingly less secure. Russia is spending more and more manpower to achieve increasingly modest results on the battlefield. Against this backdrop, and following successful strikes deep inside Russian territory, the Kremlin has announced a campaign of attacks against the Ukrainian capital. Russia's offensive is becoming slower and more costly. The pace of Russian advances has fallen to its lowest level in the past year, while losses in personnel and equipment continue to rise disproportionately. While Moscow's main advantage once lay in its large pool of manpower and resources, Ukraine is now seeking to offset that advantage through technology. Ukraine's defense forces are increasingly striking the enemy not only along the front line and in its operational rear, but also deep inside Russian territory. What remained an almost exclusive advantage for Moscow in 2022 to 2023 has gradually become possible for Ukraine as well. Experts at the Institute for the Study of War describe this as a new stage of the war. At the same time, the Kremlin has shown no willingness to change its plans on the battlefield and is attempting to compensate for its difficulties through escalation, including threats of consistent and systematic strikes against Kyiv. In recent weeks, OSINT groups and analytical centers have not recorded any significant changes in positions along the front line, even though May has traditionally been a period of intensified spring and summer campaigning by the Kremlin over the past 3 years. The war remains largely positional, with limited advances being made by both sides. However, these gains lack the operational impact that the Russian army demonstrated during its 2024 to 2025 campaigns. Ukraine's defense forces continue to hold their positions and, where circumstances allow, conduct counterattacks reaching up to 10 kilometers deep into enemy positions. This has been seen in recent weeks near the administrative border between the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia regions, in the Oleksandrovsk direction. Several senior RBC Ukraine sources identified 2 factors that have contributed to the slowdown in Russian advances, despite the fact that Russian battlefield tactics remain largely unchanged: infiltration by small groups, force accumulation, and then assaults. The first factor is that Ukraine's defense forces have begun eliminating more Russian troops on the battlefield, pushing Russian losses to around 35,000 personnel per month. According to Digital Transformation Minister Mikhailo Fedorov, the cost of Russia's advances continues to rise. While Russian forces were losing 67 soldiers for every square kilometer gained in October, that figure had increased to 179 by April. In practice, the recruitment of contract soldiers is now barely enough to offset Russia's current losses. Following meetings with military and intelligence officials, President Volodymyr Zelensky said the Kremlin could launch a new wave of mobilization to replenish its forces, potentially involving another 100,000 people. Within Russia itself, there are also signs that Moscow may be preparing such a step. People have increasingly been receiving mobilization notices requiring them to report to military enlistment offices if a new mobilization wave is announced, without the need for an additional summons. There is another possible scenario: Putin may intend to use a new mobilization not so much to reinforce existing forces as to support an offensive operation in northern Ukraine. In this case, strikes on Russian refineries are not just a symbolic response. This is pressure on the fuel balance, repair capabilities, logistics, budget, and the ability of the Russian Federation to maintain an intensive war. That is why Russia is forced to simultaneously cover the front, Crimea, border regions, Moscow, fuel and energy facilities, and its own military industry. No air defense system is limitless. A separate sign of the changing situation is Ukraine's increased control over the enemy's operational depth. If Ukrainian drones systematically strike targets at a distance of tens and hundreds of kilometers from the front line, this means that the enemy is forced to withdraw warehouses, equipment, headquarters, and control points further. And this lengthens the shoulders of logistics, reduces the pace of the offensive, and increases the cost of each Russian attack. However, this does not mean that Russia has lost its ability to wage war. The Russian Federation still has significant human resources, large ammunition stocks, missile potential, aviation, KABs, kamikaze drones, and a repressive mobilization system. In some areas, in particular in the Donetsk region, the situation remains difficult. Russia uses tactics of small assault groups, constant pressure, destruction of cities with aerial bombs and artillery, and information exaggeration of its own successes. Therefore, the correct conclusion is not that Ukraine has already won. The correct conclusion is that Russia is gradually losing its monopoly on the pace of the war. Ukraine is increasingly forcing Moscow to react, stretch resources, transfer air defenses, protect the rear, patch up logistics, and explain to its own population why the war is coming to Russian territory. An important element of this new phase is the aviation component. The expected transfer of Swedish Gripen C/DS to Ukraine and the prospect of purchasing newer Gripen ES will not create an immediate turning point. But in combination with Meteor missiles, these aircraft can strengthen Ukraine's ability to push Russian aviation away from the borders and reduce the effectiveness of the use of KABs. KABs today remain one of the most painful instruments of Russian pressure on the front and frontline cities. In parallel, Ukraine is receiving additional air defense assets, including Iris-T from Germany. But this is not enough. Massive Russian strikes on Kiev, Dnipro, and other cities show the need for Patriot, anti-ballistic missiles, air defense missiles, and multi-layered cover remains critical. There is another important international signal. France's seizure of the Russian tanker Tiger in the Atlantic demonstrates that the fight against the Russian Shadow Fleet is gradually moving from declarations to practical actions. If this approach becomes systematic, it could hit one of the key sources of financing the war: Russian energy exports bypassing sanctions. So, the strategic picture is this. Ukraine is gradually forming a new model of war, technological, asymmetric, deep, directed not only against Russian units at the front, but against the entire system of supporting war. Russia retains the ability to attack, destroy, exhaust, and terrorize civilians. But it is increasingly forced to pay for war not only in people on the front lines, but also in its economy, logistics, air defense, oil refining, shipping, and internal stability. The main risk for Ukraine is to overestimate its own advantage. The main risk for Russia is to underestimate the speed of Ukrainian adaptation. The coming months will be critical not because the war will necessarily end quickly, but because it is now being determined whether Ukraine will be able to turn its technological initiative into a strategic advantage. This requires three things: scaling up the Ukrainian defense industry, stable support from partners, and internal stability of the state. Because in a war of attrition, the winner is not the one who claims victory the loudest. The winner is the one who learns faster, produces faster, strikes more accurately, and retains the will to resist longer.